a pleasure to join the School for Unlearning Zionism. It's great to see some familiar faces. It's even better to see some unfamiliar faces, because you feel as an activist that you know everyone. And once you see someone you don't know, you are uplifted, at least for the next month, and you think that the camp is growing. It's a very good way of discussing unlearning Zionism through the paradigm of settler colonialism, or the idea of settler colonialism. It's a very interesting concept, first of all, because of its relationship to activism. Usually, if we look at the relationship between social or political activism and academic research tends to follow activism. This was true about feminism, this was true about liberation struggles, this was true about multiculturalism. And in a way, it was true when settler colonialism was first suggested as a paradigm for analyzing the situation in Palestine back in the 60s by Palestinian scholars mainly. It also was a classical case where political activism was trying to influence academia to orientate its research in a way that could help the cause, whatever the cause would be. Then settler colonialism disappeared as an idea for a while, and it reappeared recently, especially in places such as Australia, Canada, United States, Mexico, where people were talking about and writing about settler colonialism and noticed that the idea really explains very well what Zionism is all about and what Zionism was. And it also helps to understand better the nature of the situation in Palestine in the past. And quite a few people found it also inspirational in trying and envisaging a solution for the problem in the future. So let me first explain for those who are less familiar what settler colonialism is before examining its application to Palestine. And of course, this very short introduction is not a substitute for proper reading on settler colonialism, which is a rich idea, and there's a rich literature about it. So I'm going to give you a very reduced version and a very subjective one in many ways. I'm taking out of settler colonialism what really it looks to me as the most important ideas behind the concept. And it's quite possible that someone else would have had a different focus than I have. In the main, settler colonialism tries to identify within the general phenomenon of colonialism the particular phenomenon of people who were not sent by empires to colonize other places, but actually made their own way to these places outside of Europe, mainly because they were not allowed to stay in Europe. So unlike British colonialists who were sent by their empire to India or Africa, or French colonialists who were sent to other continents, or Portuguese or Spanish colonialists, here we are talking about Europeans who wanted to be in Europe, but were not allowed to be in Europe for whatever reasons. They were persecuted, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for economic reasons, or cultural reasons. And these refugees from Europe were actually looking for a place to reinvent the Europe that didn't want them. And in order to do this, they needed the help of an empire, and they also needed to do it outside of Europe. And they faced two major problems. The first one was that they didn't have the capacity to take over different countries or different lands. And as I said, they needed the help of an empire, not necessarily an empire from their own home country. They needed an empire that was interested in using them for its own interest. Later on, the interest of these settlers and the interest of the empire would clash. And this is why when we talk about the War of Independence in the United States or the War of Independence in Israel, we're talking about independence from the British Empire, which actually was the empires that allowed white settlers to colonize North America in the first case and Palestine in the second case. The second challenge was, of course, bigger, and that was the fact that the places that they chose were already inhabited by another people, by indigenous native people. And the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, noted that in the encounter between settlers and natives or indigenous population, a certain logic was operated or activated. He called it the logic of the elimination of the native. Namely, whoever these settlers were and however poor or however persecuted they were, most of them came with the notion, especially their leaders and their main activists, came with the notion that if they want to succeed of recreating a new Europe outside of Europe, if they want to make a place their home, and even more importantly, to make a place their homeland, not just a home, their major obstacle for such an implementation of the idea was the presence of another native people there. And therefore, elimination was the only way they saw open to them in order to succeed. Now, elimination could take the form of physical elimination, genocide, as indeed happened when European settlers of such kind arrived in the United States, or what became the United States in North America, and in places such as Australia, and partly even in New Zealand. In other places, such as South Africa, Palestine, to a certain extent Algeria, settlers were using other means in order to implement the logic of the elimination. In the case of Palestine, it was ethnic cleansing, removing by force the Palestinian from their homeland. Another feature of settler colonialism, which is common to all the cases we know of settler colonialism, including Palestine, is that the settlers were very busy in appropriating the history of the place which they colonized. So you're not only removing the native population from its homeland, you have to remove it from its own history and to take its own history as if it was yours, what we call in professional language, appropriation. You appropriate the history. And there are many ways of doing it, by telling the story of the native population as if it is your story, by adopting the indigenous population customs, or even clothing, as you know, Hashomer at first dressed like what they thought was a typical Arab dress, as did some American settlers. And then, of course, you use the names as the Americans did, even as Noam Chomsky cynically remarks rightly, they did even use names of Native American tribes that they had eliminated as names for their weapons, lethal weapons that they use in the American Army, such as the Apache helicopter and the Tomahawk missile, land-to-land missile. Now, this, if you look at these movements as movements of persecuted Europeans who create a national movement somewhere else, and the only way that they feel that they can do it is by taking someone else's homeland and removing them from that homeland, you see that even in this most simplistic level, settler colonialism seems to be a very appropriate way of talking about Zionism. One of the most important kind of challenge that immediately comes out when you say even what I've said so far is this: people say, no, but wait a minute. In the case of Zionism, these were people who used to live in the place they came to 2,000 years before. and they had a religious attachment. So you cannot compare a white settler who goes to North America to a Jewish settler who comes back to Palestine. Now, of course, what settler colonialism shows very clearly that in the project of appropriating the history of a place, it also builds a narrative that justifies the colonization of the place and the removal of the native population. You can do it in the name of God. You can do it in the name of socialism. You can do it in the name of enlightenment and liberalism. You can claim that you were there 2,000 years before, or you claim that you should have been there 2,000 years before. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the story is not a proof to your moral right to remove people from their homeland. It's the excuse you first give yourself and then to the rest of the world for doing what in modern history we understand is a crime against humanity. The Zionism started as a group of Jewish refugees who felt, rightly so in many ways, that Europe didn't want them, that they needed to leave. Those who, with the foresight, even understood that staying in large parts of Europe was an existential danger. And they were looking for a safe haven. Others were looking for hoping to solve the problems of Judaism by turning it from a religion to nationalism. And this fusion of the search for safety and for a national identity orientated the early Zionists towards Palestine. But of course, as you know, quite a few early Zionists were willing to consider other places to colonize. But more or less after Theodor Herzl's death in 1904, when Chaim Weizmann took over the leadership of the Zionist movement, it was very clear that Palestine was the place where the settler colonial project of Zionism had to be implemented. Now, very early on, as our colleague Nur Masalha has shown in his books, and as many other studies have shown, very early on in the negotiations of the Zionist leaders between themselves, and their negotiations that started in 1915 in earnest with British leaders, a very clear notion is conveyed to whoever is involved in Zionism from the inside or the outside. The demographic map of Palestine after the First World War has to change if Zionism wants to succeed. Namely, it has to be de-Arabized. The Arabs have to be removed for Zionism to become a successful project. All kinds of ideas are in the air, I would say, more or less until 1937. First of all, the basic idea that Zionist leaders, especially David Ben-Gurion, has when he becomes the leader of the Zionist movement in 1920, is that maybe the British, as part of their rearrangement of the Middle East, would move enough Palestinians out of Palestine, create maybe a Palestine in Transjordan, and then allow a free Arab, if you want, space for the creation of a Jewish state. That's the idea of the partition. This is the idea of turning Transjordan into Palestine. It's all there in the 20s and the early 30s already. More or less in 1936, 1937, Zionist leaders understand that Britain would not do the job for them. And it is then, in 36, 37, that kind of abstract ideas of removing the Palestinians in order for the settler colonial project to succeed are replaced by more strategic thinking. Of course, the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe and their arrival and more Jews from Europe to Palestine, and the unwillingness of countries such as Canada and the United States to open their gates for Jewish refugees, of course, increases the determination of the Zionist leaders if you want to implement the logic of the elimination of the native in a more concrete and systematic way. The reason that there was no massive expulsion of Palestinians before 1948 should be very clear. The British were still responsible for law and order, and Zionism did not have the military capacity to massively remove the Palestinians from their homeland. Although I hope some of you would know that already in the 1920s, especially in the mid-1920s, the British authorities in Palestine helped the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse quite a few Palestinians from some of the lands purchased by the Zionist movement, especially in Marj ibn Amr, which the Israelis call Emet Israel, and in Wadi Hawaris, which the Israelis call Wadi Emek Hefer. In those areas, we know that demographically, few villages disappeared long before 1948. We have a very important work by a Basque demographer by the name of Endika Rodriguez, who looked at the demography of Palestine, and he noticed that quite a few Palestinian villages disappeared before 1948 as a result of Zionist colonization. But this was not a massive expulsion. The implementation of the logic of the elimination of the native became a real program, of course, once Britain decided to leave Palestine, and it was clear that there will be a vacuum, and this was an historical opportunity for the Zionist leaders to try and make Palestine a non-Arab country, if you want. Because it's very clear, especially from 45 onwards, and we know it as Israelis afterwards, that Zionism, of course, can contain a number of Arabs within the Jewish state. It can accept that it doesn't have the capacity to expel every Palestinian who lives in Palestine. But there is a formula which is in many ways absurd, especially among liberal and democratic Zionists, that Zionism does not only have to be a Jewish state, it has to be a democratic state. Namely, the Jewish nature of the state has to be determined and verified again and again by the majority of the people who live in that state. Now, if Palestinians would not have been expelled from the state of Israel in 1948, and all of them would have stayed and become citizens of what became Israel, which is 80% of historical Palestine, and all of them who could have voted, namely above the age of 18, would have voted in the first Israeli elections in 1949, Israel would not have been a Jewish state because they were the majority. So this connection between I want a Jewish demography that is a Jewish democracy gives you the sense that actually you are getting rid of the Palestinians in the name of universal values such as democracy and enlightenment, not just in the name of Jewish nationalism. This is why the Zionist left, and not the Zionist right, committed the worst crime against the Palestinian ever, the crime of the Nakba in 1948. Now, of course, we don't have time to go to everything, but it's quite clear today that from February 1947, the months in which Britain clearly stated that it's not interested in the future of Palestine anymore, and it transfers the whole issue to the United Nations, that from that date, February 1947, to the end of 1948, the Zionist leadership was thought that it had an historical opportunity to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible and to take as much of historical Palestine as possible, which is a typical aspiration for a settler colonial movement, whatever the means that they're using or whatever part of the world they are. They want a new home country without the native population and as much of that home country as possible. Look at the drive of the Americans to the West and the genocide of the Native Americans there. It's a very similar process. Now, the fact that Palestinians were trying to oppose this kind of an operation, the fact that there were volunteers coming from the Arab world before May the 15th, 1948, and the fact that regular Arab units or units of regular Arab armies entered Palestine after the 15th of May 1948, regardless of what they could have done and didn't do, because the potential to stop this was much larger than actually happened. Because of these, the Palestinian resistance, because of the Arab world intervention in what happened in Palestine, especially after the 15th of May 1948, the idea of the Zionist leaders to turn Palestine into a country free of all Palestinians was not fully implemented. But what was implemented was quite significant. By the end of 1948, the Israeli forces have already destroyed the whole urban space of Palestine. They de-Arabized the most important Palestinian towns of Jaffa, of Haifa, of West Jerusalem, of Akka. These towns and cities had a rich cultural and social and political history that, had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, would have advanced the Palestinian people into being one of the most successful and impressive Arab societies in the world. But it was lost with the destruction of these countries, of these towns and cities. Most of them, by the way, were destroyed long before May the 15th, already in April 1948, namely the whole Israeli narrative that people became refugees because the Arab armies entered Palestine is a lie, sheer lie. First, the Israelis expelled hundreds of thousands of people, especially from the urban space. And then the Arab governments, by the way, quite reluctantly, sent troops in order to try and stop the continuation of that ethnic cleansing, and did not do a very good job, because hundreds of thousands or more Palestinians were expelled also after May the 15th, 1948. Now, the destruction of the towns, of the cultural and political elites before the 15th of May made it easier, of course, to expel the rest of the Palestinian population. But of course, the massive expulsion the mass expellers did not have the capacity and the stamina to complete it. And this is why we have what we call the Palestinian minority in Israel. And the West Bank was outside the reach of the Israelis because of a prior agreement with the Jordanians. And Israel created the Gaza Strip in order to push hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into a mega refugee camp. But this was ethnic cleansing, which is defined by international law as a crime against humanity, which is not only that the people who committed it were never brought to justice, it is still denied by most people who have any power in the world to change the reality in Palestine. Settler colonialism does not only explain the Nakba, the catastrophe, it also explains what Israel does to the Palestinians after 1948. The military rule that was imposed on the Palestinian minority in Israel between 1948 to 1966 is another means of implementing the elimination of the native. Because what settler colonial states do quite successfully, we know from history, they adapt their strategy to the circumstances which change, to their capacities which changed. So Palestinians inside Israel, although quite a few of them continued to be victims of expulsions, at least until 1956, there was a different measure in order to exclude them from the Jewish democracy. A military rule, as you know, is something that robs you of your most basic human and civil rights. And then when Israel occupied those parts of Palestine that they did not occupy in 1948, in the June 67 war, it transferred the military rule from inside Israel, from the one imposed on one Palestinian group and reimposed it on a second Palestinian group, the people who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And any serious analysis of the Israeli strategy immediately after 1967, how to deal with millions with the addition of new millions of Palestinians within the mindset of a settler colonial state, could see how the same parameters that informed the Israelis in 1948 informed their attitude towards the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and inside Israel. And of course, one can add to this Israeli attitude towards the Palestinians, refugees' right of return. The idea all the time is this interplay between geography and demography, if you want, between space and population. Space is something you want, something which you can easily take. You are the strongest military power in 67, and nobody can compete with Israeli militarily since 67 in the Middle East. So you can take any part of the Middle East that you want. But what do you do with the people if they live in the new space that you take? Take, for example, the Golan Heights. Israel wanted the Golan Heights. It took the Golan Heights within 48 hours in 67. And then the Israeli soldiers, commanders, leaders, noticed that nobody's paying attention. And they ethnically cleansed 120,000 people from the Golan Heights within few days and destroyed more than 100 villages on the Golan Heights. This was an ethnic cleansing that is not reported anywhere, the one in 67. So Israel could easily annex the Golan Heights. It was very easy to take the Golan Heights and make it a consensual Israeli Zionist issue. Why? Because there's no real significant presence of indigenous native Palestinians there. But what do you do with the West Bank? It's very clear what you do with the Gaza Strip, by the way, since 2005. You just siege the Gaza Strip. You enclose it, which leads to an incremental genocide of the people there. But you close it, you observe it from the outside, you turn it into a mega prison, and that's another means of having the place without the people. But of course, it doesn't work with the Palestinians inside Israel, and it doesn't work with the Palestinians in the occupied territories. So the Israelis developed two kinds of systems, I would say. One for the occupied territories, one for the occupied West Bank. And this is very clear, and it took time for them to strategize it properly. And the idea is that you narrow or you downsize the space that Palestinians have, and you take every space that they don't have and you Judaize it. You make it part of Israel, either through official annexation or de facto annexation. It doesn't matter. It is yours. I think the Oslo Accord was the first time that the Israelis attempted it. I'm talking mainly on the Oslo II Accord, the division to areas A, B, and C. And if there are still people in spaces you want in the West Bank, like in the Jordan Valley or in the South Hebron Mountain, Masaf Eryata, in the area of Masaf Eryata, you ethnically cleanse the people. The same is true about Greater Jerusalem. So you use a mixture of ethnic cleansing and enclaving the Palestinians in smaller and smaller demographic enclaves. There is debate in Israel whether these enclaves should be called the Palestinian state or not, between what is called the right wing and the left wing in Israel. But it all is within a settler colonial ideology that doesn't want to see the people, as the left in Israel says, they are there and we are here. It's much more problematic when it comes, and I'm coming to the close of my talk, it's much more problematic with the Palestinians inside Israel. But here comes the Israeli nationality law and a proper apartheid law that the Israeli Knesset adopted in the summer of 2018, which of course adapts itself to a different reality vis-a-vis the Palestinian citizens in Israel. Legislation from above that assures apartheid creations of settlements only for Jews, or allows towns like Afula to decide that they will never allow Palestinians to live there. and a kind of navigation between, and not an easy one for the Israelis, between a wish to be seen still as a democracy inside at least the 67 areas, and the wish to continue and implement the logic of the elimination of the native in practice. Let me just say as two last sentences, as I've started, I have another 4 minutes, trying to, this is Germany, I'm talking with German people here, I want to be finished exactly at 30 minutes. It is, for me at least, and this is very personal what I'm going to say now, this is not academic or scholarly, but I think it's important to say this. For me, it's very clear that the only way to solve a settler colonial reality, which for me is unjust historically, unjust morally, unacceptable in any circumstances, in any place in the world, including in Palestine, the only way of changing it is by decolonization. It's not very easy to define decolonization in the 21st century. It was very easy to think about it in the 1950s and the 1960s. But for me, it's very clear that very much like in apartheid South Africa, you need to have a different kind of relationship between now the third generation of settlers and the native indigenous population. You have to rectify injustices that were made in the past. You have to have a basis of equality for the future. And for that reason, as I said, that's my personal view, for that reason, I think that any two-state solution that is on offer, including the ones that Palestinians are offering, some Palestinians are offering, is not going to change the settler colonial nature of the state of Israel or the reality in historical Palestine. It would just enable the settler colonial ideology to be the hegemonic ideology of the state of Israel. And this ideology would continue to inform the attitudes of official Israel towards the Palestinians wherever they are. Only a country that doesn't have the regime of settler colonialism, in this case Zionism, is the only country which has a chance of getting out of the 120 years of bloodshed and conflict and building a different society, both for the settlers and the natives, the indigenous population, and maybe even succeed in building something which will influence positively the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole. So I will stop here, and I'm very happy to take your comments and questions.
Thank you, Ilan, for doing the impossible task of having only half an hour to speak about this. And I think you made very many very important, interesting points. I have all my own questions, but that would be greedy. So I will start only with one of my questions, and I welcome everyone to write some questions in the chat, and then we will take them as well. There are already a few. I wonder if you would say, so if we recognize Zionism as settler colonialism, what does this mean for the struggle for equality?
Okay.
And maybe that has to do with the first question that someone wrote. Can you repeat why the Zionist left caused most harm towards ethnic cleansing?
Yeah. Yes. We all want, I think, those of us who are activists for peace and reconciliation would like very much to live in a society that is based on universal values of humanity. And of course, one of the reasons Zionist leaders could order destruction of whole villages and expulsion of people, including children, women and old men, and civilians in general, one of the reasons you do it because a settler community immediately dehumanizes the native. And once you dehumanize another person or another group of people, there is a very you're not limited in what you can do to them. So for me, rehumanizing, if you want, the Palestinians, not in their own eyes. In their own eyes, they always knew exactly who they are and what they did, and Israel did not succeed in doing that. But in order for the Israelis to learn again how to humanize the people who were the victims, kind of a new relationship between victimizers and victim, equality is not just a neutral term where suddenly tomorrow we are getting up and we are all equal. No. In order to create this equality, the occupier, the colonizer, the apartheid men or women need to pay a certain price to get there. It's very clear. You have to give up your privileges. You have to give up maybe lands that you have expropriated. You may have to agree to redistribution of wealth because it comes together. You may even inject some insecurity into your life because God knows what 120 years of oppression of other people would do. And yes, all this is something that you have to accept because, not only because it's the only way forward, because you have to ask yourself, do you want to be on that side of history where criminals exist, where oppressors are mentioned, where colonizers are mentioned, or would you like to be on a different memory lane of history? I think that is also very, very, very important. Now, for the question of the Zionist left, it's the Zionist left is the one that led the Zionist project until 1977. And because of that, it needed to deal in the formative period with the presence of the Palestinians. You know, it's if you think about the people who spoke most clearly about removing Palestinians, the people who actually ordered their troops to destroy a village, to massacre, to really dehumanize totally the Palestinians. These people came from the heart of what we used to call the socialist, Zionist ideological stream. I'm not saying that there was no right-wing Zionism. There was right-wing Zionism. And what the Irgun, the Etzel, and the Stern Gang, the Lehi did, was as horrible in terms of the Nakba. No, I'm not absolving them from the crimes committed in 48. I'm just saying that the massive crime was planned and executed by those who saw themselves as representing both Zionism and socialism. And that's what I mean by left. Now, of course, left changes later on, and it becomes the people who are for two states or not two states, and this is something else. But I'm talking about the historical responsibility.
Thank you. There's a question if you could comment about the paragraph from the new book, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, by Canadian historian Dr. Derek Penslar, where he writes, Herzl enthusiastically supported European colonialism. In 1898, during a public debate about Zionism in Berlin, Herzl said, "Don't you know what a colonial age we are living in? As a consequence of overpopulation and of the resultant ever more acute social question, in parentheses, European anti-Semitism, many nations are endeavoring to found overseas colonies in order to channel the flow of immigration back. This is the policy which England has been pursuing for decades and which has been regarded as exemplary, almost finished, by many nations. I believe that Germany too has taken steps to become a greater Germany since it has looked across the seas and has striven to found colonies everywhere." Page 138. That was a citat. If you could comment on that,
yeah.
Or if you wish to.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I have a lot of respect for Derek Penslar, but I don't think he understands to the very end the whole character of Herzl, which was he was quite an anti-Semite, Herzl. He really hated Jews. And it's very important to look at Herzl's conversations with German leaders and British leaders. It's not a coincidence that Herzl only visited Palestine for a few minutes in all his biography. Herzl was not looking for a solution for the Jews in Germany or the Jews in Britain. He was looking for a solution for what he called the poor Ostjuden, the poor East European Jews. That is very, very important. So it's not just a matter of colonialism, which, to be honest, in 1898, people looked at colonialism something positive. There's nothing surprising by the fact that he discusses colonialism as a positive project. The whole of Europe looked at colonialism as something positive. What is far more important, I think, is not that he supported colonialism, was that actually in his conversations, and now we have his diaries, you know, and he reports very pedantically in his conversations with British leaders, with German leaders, and his friends there. And he says, because his German and British friends say to him, you know, what we are worried is that all these East Europeans would come to Britain and Germany. And he says, exactly, he says, you don't want that. I don't want that. Let them go to Palestine and create there. And I think that this is an ambiguity, because on the other hand, of course, in other books of his he becomes very enthusiastic about a Jewish state, but he wants them to build it and then come and visit it when it is there. He doesn't want to live there, but he's very much want to visit it, as his utopian book says in 1924 when Germans come to look at it. I think this is very, very important about Herzl, but I think he's less important from a Palestinian perspective, unfortunately. The people who are important are Chaim Weizmann and onwards, that understood that Britain is the empire that would do it for them. And then they come to Palestine, and with people like Sishkin and Artur Rupin and others, they begin to talk about the practical project of turning a country which was Arab, mostly Muslim, but Arab, and had a different kind of future in front of her, and turn it into something else, which led to a huge tragedy to the people who lived there for centuries.
Thank you. Have any other settler colonial projects been as successful, in quote unquote, as Israel? Which historical examples are there of how such entities evolve? And I'm going to connect that to another question asking about the relationship between settler colonialism and imperialism, and specifically the relationship between the US and Israel. Sorry, I connected two questions. I'm trying to take.
That's okay. That's okay. Let's try and do it. Well, unfortunately, although I have a lot of Native American friends and Aboriginal friends who would be angry with me if I would say that the American settler colonial project was successful, unfortunately. So was the Australian one. But by successful, I mean, of course, by genociding the people. No, they have not disappeared, of course, and there is a huge and important struggle by these native people, indigenous people, and we all hope and support them, and maybe at least some of the injustice inflicted upon them would be rectified. But unfortunately, they have lost a lot, but they're still there and struggling. That's very important to say. So yeah, there are different kind of examples. Of course, settler colonialism was defeated in certain places. One is Algeria, the other one is South Africa. I also believe that in Palestine, eventually, it's not going to work. The second question about settler colonialism and imperialism. Yes, it's very interesting. Of course, one thing is you have a common background. And there was quite a lot of books writing about this, the same kind of settler colonial ethos that informs both the American and the Israeli society, and is one of the many reasons, by no way the only reason, for the kind of strong friendship, if you want, between the United States and Israel. However, imperialism acts very differently than colonialism, I think, American imperialism. When it comes to Israeli settler colonialism, I think American supporters of Israel, even the Christian Zionists, are less interested, as the British were, because the British were there when it was the formative period, in the plans of the Israelis of how to deal with the Palestinians. I think their take is very different. Their take is that we don't interfere with what Israel wants to do, and whatever Israel wants to do is the right thing. Uh, Whereas when Zionism began, it needed an affirmation for the exact thing that he wanted, and from Britain. So I think American imperialism sustains an ethnic, racist state in the Middle East, is willing to portray it as the only democracy in the Middle East. Uh, and different, I don't have time to go into it, it's a different lecture. The different American sections of the American public and political establishment, different sections support this settler colonial setting for different reasons. You cannot sort of reduce the American support for the settler colonial project into one position. But one layer of this support definitely has to do with the joint history of settler colonialism. There's no doubt about it. And Zionist leaders themselves write about, they see themselves as the pioneers of America. They're using the word pioneer as well in Hebrew, chalutz. The influence comes from the United States. But as I said, this is really a different lecture on the American-Israeli relationship. And we learn more and more as we go into it as historians and academics.
Thank you. I have to think about the saying, tell me who your friends are. Okay, next question. Do you think that Israel will one day come to an end like the colonial systems in South Africa and Algeria?
Yes, I do think so. I don't think regimes of this kind are sustainable for in the long run. But the long run in history is long. I have to warn you. So I'm not saying it because I know when it's going to happen, but I don't think it's sustainable for forever. But of course, I'm not in the business of prediction, and I'm not a futuristic scholar. I'm an activist, so I'm working to change the reality, but I don't know if it will work and when it will work. But there is a sense that whatever seems to be a great success in Israel, including the new agreements with Bahrain and the Emirates, or a very pro-Israeli American president, new countries in Europe, especially those who were horrible in the Holocaust, supporting Israel as if they were Zionists from the day they were born. With all these achievements, so-called achievements, I still think that none of them creates a solution for the Israelis for how to continue and implement the elimination of the native in the 21st century, with its sensitivities, with its different perceptions of reality, and none of the military weapons in the Israeli arsenal have really are any solution to the real problem of creating here something that would be sustainable, not just economically or politically, but also morally.
Thank you. Question. At first, the British wanted Palestine to be a Jewish state. Later on, they made the Arab states start a war because they wanted to protect their defense agreement of the strategic area. Can you please comment about that?
My PhD was on Britain's attitude towards the 1948 clash. So I really examined, this is one topic I talk with some authority. Britain did not want the Arab states to go to war, not at all. Britain actually wanted one thing, was to leave quickly without any casualties for British officers and civilians. Once they decided they didn't want to be in Palestine, they did everything they could to go out. The one thing that Britain began to understand from London, not from Palestine, was that they became aware that there was a secret agreement between Transjordan, King Abdullah in Transjordan, and the Jewish agency, the leadership of the Israelis, of the Jewish community in pre-Israel Palestine. And they supported this alliance. And they thought that actually annexation of parts of Palestine to Transjordan, already in the 30s, they thought that. Annexation of parts of Transjordan, of Palestine to Transjordan, and a Jewish state next to it is the best they can hope for when they leave. What they didn't want is what they called the Mufti state, namely an independent Palestinian state. That's one of the reasons that they abstained in the vote in the United Nations. So I don't think they encourage Arab governments to go to war. In fact, they kept reporting to London that should the Arab armies go to war in Palestine, they would lose. The British military advisors of all the Arab armies wrote to their government that the Arab armies are ill-prepared, ill-coordinated, without any training, and they stood very little chance of defeating the Jewish forces in Palestine.
Here's a comment in Hebrew. במאמר דיבולט פרסם הרצל תוכנית ליסוד בנק קולוניאלי יהודי שיממן את יצירת היהודים מאירופה ואת התיישבותם בארצם החדשה. So this is a comment regarding Herzl. I think it's not so much a question and his support or colonial view. What do you suggest as practical solutions to decolonize and de-Zionize Jews in Israel?
Yeah, well, I'm one person and I'm not going to suggest a solution, but I'm part of a movement of thinking and so on. So let me shortly say it in two ways, how to my mind you decolonize in the 21st century, especially in the case of Palestine. One telegraphic way, which I always like to say, is the 3 A's. The first A is acknowledgement. I don't think you can create a process of decolonization without both Israeli and international acknowledgement of the crime committed against the Palestinians in 48 and ever since 48. And I think acknowledgement is a very important part of any decolonization in our age and time. The second aid is accountability. Acknowledgement without accountability is useless. And accountability in the case of Palestine can easily be translated to tangible ideas, such as the right of the refugees to return, the redistribution of wealth, of natural resources, of creating a more equal society, both on economic and social basis, not just political basis. Look at post-apartheid South Africa, what happens when you neglect to redistribute the economic assets. The political equality is not enough. And the third A is acceptance. I think then the settlers become organic part of the new place and are accepted as legitimate within that part of the world that they have colonized. And I think that it also means, and this is one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, of course, which is the most difficult challenge. That's why I'm not optimistic for the near future, but I am for the longer future. The whole process of liberation and decolonization has to be led by the indigenous native people. That's what white activists in South Africa realized. You don't create a white peace camp that helps a black peace camp in Africa. No, you join the ANC. And here we have two problems. One is the PLO was never keen on accepting in a significant way Jewish members, although there were two. One died, Ilan Halevi, may he rest in peace, and why may he live long as he can, Uri Davis. But I think it's time to think about a PLO that includes anti-Zionist Jews, especially from Israel. And the second problem, of course, is that the fragmentation and disunity on the Palestinian side does not allow them to prepare a counter deal for instance, to Donald Trump's deal of the century, or one should call steal of the century. Uh, uh, if these conditions can be somehow worked out, the Palestinian national movement can redefine the liberation project in the 21st century, define decolonization as it sees it, and get the support from those Jews in Israel and beyond who understand that this is the only way forward. The continuation of waiting for two peace camps to find a common ground, the idea of partition, all this may have been valid or was not valid, it doesn't matter anymore. It's totally irrelevant to the 21st century and will only allow the settler colonialist project to continue for a longer while.
Thank you very much. We are running towards the end. Last question that I seem to have missed. I go back. Yaakov Rabkin writes in his latest book that the Zionists took up Protestant ideas. Protestants were also very close to Theodor Herzl. Also, Balfour had Christian Zionist ideas. Can we see Zionism in a broader frame of European colonialism and imperialism? And I think, sadly, that is a last question. And after that, I would love to wrap it up.
Yeah.
I wanted to. We would love to.
That's okay. I'm trying to condense into 10 minutes of replies in a course I give in the university for 12 meetings.
We will definitely have to invite you.
Definitely. Yes, I think Mr. Rafkin is absolutely right. And this is a very important comment. Zionism began as a Christian project, long before it was a Jewish project. It was a Christian project of a certain theological stream in evangelical Christianity called the Restorationists, people who believe that the return of the Jews to Palestine is part of a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of time. And these people were not marginal, neither in Britain nor in the United States, already in 1820s. And they really influenced the political elites in their countries to support the idea of the return of the Jews. They also were anti-Semites, and they were very happy not only to restore the Jews to Palestine so that the only Jew that they really loved, Jesus Christ, would come back. They also wanted to get rid of the Jews they didn't like, which was all the other Jews. So I think that is absolutely true. That's a very strong, important brick in the structure that held together the lobbying for Zionism, support for Zionism. Finally, yes, it's true about the Balfour as well, or Herzl, it doesn't matter. In the case of Balfour, it's very, very important. With this, we will end. We have to remember that Lord Balfour, in 1905, 1906, legislated or led the legislation in the British Parliament that would prevent Jews who were persecuted in Russia from coming to England. He was the main mover behind this legislation. And he really did all he could to stop Jews from coming to Britain. And when he met for the first time, actually, Herzl, in 1915, he suddenly saw the connection between the idea of restoring the Jews to Palestine, which all his family, by the way, was a Christian Zionist family, believed in, and his own strategic thinking that actually it would be very good for Britain to have another foothold, given the fact that already in 1915, it was clear that the Ottoman Empire was enemy of Britain, was about to lose the war, and Britain would have new possessions in the area. So yes, when the Palestinians are not, the importance of all of this, and this would be my last sentence, the Palestinians were facing already in 1915 an alliance that, given who they were, a pastoral people living mostly in villages and 30% in towns, they were facing already an alliance of Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism that was trying to solve anti-Semitism, evangelical aspiration, and imperial strategic interest at their expense. And they had no army, They had no capacity, they had no capital, they had no allies. And this did not get better. It got all the time worse when America joined that anti-Palestinian alliance. And this is why I think the Palestinians should look for different allies. And they exist. They exist in Southeast Asia, they exist in Latin America, they exist in the European left, they exist elsewhere. So I think it's another thing. We all have to think of how to build an alliance to show solidarity with people who were not only victims of a strong alliance, they were victims probably one of the strongest alliance in modern history.